This podcast contains discussions on sexual misconduct. Topics such as sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment may be discussed. Listener discretion is advised.
We are in a major period of regression. Regression on human rights generally, but particularly the rights of women and girls and the LGBTIQ community.
In this episode, I speak to Elizabeth Broderick, globally acknowledged leader, social innovator, and advocate for major change initiatives in complex political, social, and organizational environments.
But when you look up at the leadership, they've got all the nice words about respect and, equality and inclusion. But the way they're behaving is just totally an anathema to that.
Based on her broad experience in the field, she highlights the big issues and solutions around preventing and addressing sexual misconduct in the aid sector.
What I found is if you want to engage men to step up and create change, they need to be emotionally attached to the case for change.
This is the #NoExcuse podcast, discussing the challenges, complexities, and potential solutions in preventing and responding to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in the aid sector, through interviews with victims and survivors, experts, aid workers, artists, and leaders. The podcast is produced by the World Health Organization's Department for the Prevention and Response to Sexual Misconduct. I'm Guni Dias, your host and global focal point for the department. So welcome, Elizabeth Broderick, to the #NoExcuse podcast.
Thanks very much, Guni. It's fabulous to be here.
You have such a fascinating career. And just to highlight few of many accomplishments you've had, you established first yourself as a lawyer, and you were a former Sex Discrimination Commissioner, a highly respected women's rights campaigner, a UN Rapporteur, and you've been instrumental in improving gender equity in Australia. What brought you from law to being such a relentless force for gender equality?
I often ask myself that question, how is it that I've ended up here? And I think we all do that later in our lives. We try and work out what's kind of set us on this path. And for me, Guni, I don't think there was any specific individual incident. When I think back, I think more it's that I was born an identical twin. And I think when you're placed on this earth as part of two of you, then you're born with an innate sense of fairness. I still remember, every birthday, if my twin sister got something which was more valuable, or I perceived it to be more valuable than I got, then I knew that the world wasn't fair. So it was kind of as basic as that. And I think that kind of came into my DNA. And as I went through my life and had various experiences, for example, my father was a medical specialist, and I used to work with my sister from about the age of 4 at his surgery. So we'd just make cups of tea and take those to the patients. I think that experience was about really sitting with people at times often of immense suffering. He used to do medical imaging, so he was looking for tumours and cancers. And just being with people who were experiencing, real hardship, I think, was another thing that probably set me on this path. And then, of course, as I went to school and through university, it probably wasn't until I got into the workforce that I really experienced, like so many other women across the world, issues of sexual misconduct. I worked in the 80s in a law firm, and I have to say it was like the Wild West. These types of behaviours were so normalised. It was really male-dominated. Several years ago, I decided to tell my own story of sexual harassment. I didn't tell it because it was more important than anyone else's story. In fact, much less important, I'm sure. But I told it because it had all the elements of every woman's story of sexual misconduct. And when I talk about that, I mean silence, shame, going from loving a job to hating it, constant questioning of myself about what I did to make myself a target. So that, I think, just is reinforced. And as I've gone on, and as you said, especially stepping up into global roles, I've actually, borne witness to some of the human rights violations against women and girls in the world today. And that's just made me more and more resolved to use whatever influence I had to create a more gender equal world.
And as a UN Special Rapporteur on discrimination against women and girls, you reported on these issues globally. What was it like moving from fighting gender equality in Australia to the global stage? And what have been some of the most pressing concerns you've encountered?
Yeah, it was such a privilege to step up into a global role. I mean, I'd done quite a bit of work with the United Nations anyway, just through my role as Sex Discrimination Commissioner here in Australia. So I knew that whilst the issues in some ways were similar, because, gender inequality exists in every country of the world today, I also started to understand at a much greater level just how they were presenting in other countries, and just to learn and get curious about that, and really also to understand that gender inequality is about power. Mm-hmm. And really, if we want to create a gender equal world, it is about shifting power, redistributing power. So that also involved working with men, because pretty much in every country of the world today, it's men who hold, not exclusively, but largely hold the levers of power. And when I look at what are the issues presenting for women and girls across the world, the main thing that I would say is that we are in a major period of regression. Regression on human rights generally, mm-hmm. but particularly the rights of women and girls and the LGBTIQ community. So what does that look like? Well, my mandate did a country mission into Afghanistan, which is one extreme, mm-hmm. Looking at the systematic erosion of women's rights over time. But you don't have to go to Afghanistan to see that. Even looking in many developed nations, and I'm talking about those nations like the US, where the erasure and the limits to women's reproductive rights, in half the states of the US, women are no longer able to access termination or even medical services that they might rely on. Mm-hmm. And it disproportionately impacts on low-income women, on, Black American women. But even if I look across Europe and if I look in our region here, the issues of violence against women, they've increased in pretty much every region of the world, so that continues to loom as a big issue, and also women's lack of economic empowerment. So these were the types of issues that we were looking at, women's lack of access to leadership opportunities. These were the types of issues that we were looking at in my UN mandate. So there's many similarities between Australia and the rest of the world, but the degree and sometimes how those issues present are quite different.
Mm-hmm. And one of your notable achievements was persuading some of the most powerful men in Australia to join the Male Champions of Change initiative. And I'd be really interested to know, how can similar initiatives be implemented in the aid sector to tackle sexual misconduct?
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because mm-hmm. I think when I came in as Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Guni, that I kind of thought, look, I'm just going to contact all the amazing women I know across this country, and together we'll get this issue of gender equality sorted. Mm-hmm. And it's so much more complex than that. But also I started to understand after a couple of years that actually gender equality is about the redistribution of power. And if we want to redistribute power, we need to work with those who hold the levers of power. And that's largely, although not exclusively, men. So with that understanding, I'd love to say to you, I did a whole lot of analysis and research. I just picked up the phone and started ringing some of the most powerful men that I didn't know. I just read about them in the newspaper ostensibly. So the first man that I spoke to, actually, he was the CEO of one of the large tech companies operating in our region here. And I knew he had twins, a boy and a girl.
Mm-hmm.
So I figure he was good as my first target. So I rang him and just talked him through the areas of inequality. I helped him see, probably for the first time, that his daughter would never have the same opportunities as her twin brother, all because she was born a girl. And, when that kind of clicked, he said, well, where do I sign on? Yes, I want to do something about that. And then I worked out, if you get a few powerful men signing on, then all the other men want to join up as well. So we started from 6 to now 270 CEOs, some of them not of private sector, many of them not private sector. There's the chief of the military, the head of our public service departments, a whole range of different ones, but coming together in different groups, learning from each other, being in an environment of peers. And what I learned is that men become bolder when they're with their peers. So someone will come in and say, look, we've just announced a 12-week paid parental leave scheme for our women. And the other men will look at him and say, well, wait a tick. We've got 15 weeks. And then someone will say, well, we've got 20 weeks. So, a happy byproduct, I think, is some of the competitiveness that happens when you put really decent, good men who want to create change in environments like that. So that was the genesis of the Champions of Change strategy. We now have many women who are also part of that strategy, and they're doing incredible work to really build in gender equal and inclusive design right from the get-go, rather than changing existing systems. But when I look at how that could be applied to the aid sector and aid organisations, the fact is, even if there's a lot of women on the front line, which there is in humanitarian organisations like the WHO, the fact is that power will still be held by men. And I think engaging powerful men through the data, so having data is really important, but also we need the human story. What I found is if you want to engage men to step up and create change, they need to be emotionally attached to the case for change. And I just want to give you one example of that. When I thought about, bringing some of these, particularly senior businessmen, to start to understand domestic and family violence, I realised I could put all the data in front of them, but without understanding the impact of family violence on women, they would never be minded to step up in a really intentional way. So I brought in 2 survivors of domestic violence, one who's a very courageous, incredible woman in this country, Rosie Batty, whose son Luke had been killed by her ex-husband. And when the rest of us would have just curled up and wanted to die, she came out fighting in front of the media. And she then was gracious enough to come and speak to these men, to tell her story, and to help them see that at so many points she tried to reach out and get assistance at work, at so many different points, but no one was listening. So it helped them see that when women living with violence speak, the system doesn't listen. And every one of these men makes up the system. So I think it was through those types of initiatives, plus data, plus having men who have power in the system, bringing those things together in a really intentional way, was what created change in this country, together with the amazing civil society and everything else that's here. But I think, to look at those working in the aid sector, to see this as one possible route to change would be a step forward. And, I'm really happy to share everything that we've developed, because now we're 10 years into that journey, and what's happening now in terms of the innovative approaches that organisations, institutions and individuals are adopting has been a phenomenal shift.
I'd be curious to know, is there, in the growth of this community of men who are, standing up for equality, are there men stepping down from this community? And if yes, why?
Yeah. Well, everyone who's involved in this community must publish every year all their results about not just how many women are at leadership level or across their organisation, but how many sexual harassment complaints they have, and now the gender pay gap, which in a sense is a proxy for how gender equal your organisation is. All that data is exposed every year. And I also think it's the transparency that comes from that that actually drives progress as well, because it's the largest voluntary disclosure of core gender-related violence anywhere in the world that we can see. So I think that's a way of holding people to account as well. It's all very well to say you're a champion of change, but if your numbers are not also showing us that, why would we believe you? So I think that accountability has to also be part of the picture.
That's really smart. Elizabeth, do you have any examples of how to get people emotionally attached to this? Because you've given examples of how to engage men through emotions, but any concrete examples?
Yes, actually, just recently, I was doing what we call a purposeful storytelling. So I bring together the senior leader, it's usually the most senior person, the CEO or whatever, together with a person who's experienced the harmful behaviour to have a conversation. And just a couple of months ago, I brought in a man who'd been relentlessly bullied over almost a year. He tried to reach out to HR, to his manager, whatever. Nothing seemed to work. And so I brought him in to tell his story to his CEO. And halfway through the storytelling, he said, would you mind if I read into our meeting a letter that my daughter wrote to me last month on Father's Day? And this is what his beautiful daughter had written. And I read it with her permission. It reads, Daddy, I love you, always and forever. Love, Isabella. Dear Daddy, oh my God, where do I begin? You are my knight in shining armour, the joy to my laugh and the love in my life. I don't think that in all my 15 years of being alive, I've ever met anyone as brave as you. I know that life's been really tough lately and some very bad and very sad things have happened to you at work. But what you need to know is that I'm always here for you and we will always get through this together. I remember when I was younger, we'd go to the beach and we'd let those waves crash up against us. They were so powerful, but not as powerful as you. I'd be scared, but before those waves could reach me, you would scoop me up into your arms, the place where I was always safe. And Dad, that was the day I realised you would always protect me, and the day I realised I would always protect you. And I think it's a beautiful example of a fact that these harmful behaviours have an impact not just on an individual, but everyone that individual's connected to, and particularly in the family. So if that's not a reason to actually step up and lead in this moment, I don't know what is. And I know for that leader, that was the galvanising moment when this man pulled out the letter from his daughter.
You've helped WHO to understand better the concept of organizational betrayal, which is something that the WHO workforce can really relate to after the widespread allegation of sexual misconduct in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2019. And since 2021, WHO has, launched, some would say, ambitious efforts to address sexual misconduct by our workforce. Can you share with our audience what the opposite of that looks like, which is organizational courage? What should UN agencies do for institutional culture change?
Yeah, I know that WHO has done some terrific work in this area over the last few years, and I really commend you on that. Organizational courage, it starts with leadership, I think, Goni. So it's having leaders who are prepared to put their own kind of political capital on the line to really build commitment. And when I talk about commitment, I'm not just talking about words. I mean, we are what we do, not what we say. So we need leaders who are walking in the organisation in a manner that's totally congruent with the cultural change that's desired in that organisation. Look, I can't tell you the number of organisations I go into, and they want to invest in cultural change, transformation. But when you look up at the leadership, I mean, they've got all the nice words about respect and equality and inclusion, but the way they're behaving is just totally an anathema to that. So I think organisational courage starts with the most senior leaders every day, walking not just in the organisation, but in the world in a way that's congruent with that. Now, how do you start to get that to happen? I think a number of ways, but once again, getting back to what we were talking about before is emotional attachment to the case for change. Finding your personal why, I think, is absolutely critical. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of that. About a decade ago, I started working with Australia's military, our Defence Force. And the reason I did that is that there had been a, really appalling treatment of one particular woman in our tri-service military academy. So I came in at the request of our government to see whether that was just an isolated event or whether it was a mistreatment of women all across the military. So I travelled everywhere and I spoke to thousands of individuals, my team and I, and women would know when I was coming onto the base or onto a particular asset, and they would come and tell me their stories. Now, many of them are stories that, well, firstly, most of our stories had never been told before. It just wasn't safe to speak. Many of our stories were of good stories about how the military had supported them through childbearing and maternity leave and things. But on occasion, I have to say some of the stories were deeply distressing. And yes, I recorded them in my reports, which I tabled in Australia's Parliament. But what occurred to me was if I could help the leaders of this organisation, the generals at the top, see what was happening under their leadership in terms of human harm, maybe I could help them find their personal why. And so I flew in women from all across Australia, also from deployed environments, and some men who came to tell their story. And I still remember the first young woman. She had duxed the military course. She was exactly the talent that they wanted. But as her story unfolded, it became, really obvious that the treatment she'd received was so far away from that. And I still remember I had the Chief of Army actually sitting in his chair. I said, I don't want you to wear any military garb. I want you to come in your civilian clothes. This is about human beings who share the planet connecting together. So he was there. I was sitting in the seat beside him. And we had the box of tissues in the middle and this beautiful young woman who'd chosen to bring her mother. And she talked about, going on exercise when no one spoke to her, being sexually assaulted by her instructor, the very person that she chose to go to for advice. And then when she found the courage to speak out, just having her career trashed because she was seen to be letting the team down. And I still remember, that mother, she looked at the Chief of Army and she said, you know what? I gave you the person I love most in the world, and this is how you've treated her. And I swear, we just wanted the kind of ground to open up and swallow us all up. It was just such a different experience to reading about one, sexual harassment or assault or whatever on a spreadsheet and saying, oh, well, that's only one, we'll put that over there. This was the depth of emotion. You can't unfeel, unsee, unhear. And the military, to their enormous credit, went on and did 800 of those sessions with their military leaders. And that, I think, is what laid the foundation for the cultural reform efforts that have existed in Australia's military. And even I caught up with them just last week. I was up the top of Australia at one of the big military bases, and I met so many women who've subsequently come into the military. We have now, I think it's about 22, 23%. But when I look at leadership, there'll be in July of our army, the top 4 generals, 3 of them will be women. Now, that would never have happened in the history of our country. So, yes, there's still a lot more work to do. But what I'm trying to suggest is that when you engage people's hearts, even in the most conservative and traditional organisations, they can transform. But it takes courageous organisational leadership.
That's such a powerful message to any organizations who are trying to make that change. It will not be easy. It will be uncomfortable. But it's possible.
It is possible, and it's possible in a reasonable period of time, Goni, as well. I mean, I think one thing that I've learned is, sitting with the discomfort of what's happening on your watch. People want to just get away from that. What actions can I take? What can I do? But as we know, cultural change, firstly, it takes time, and it's not so much about immediate action. It's about the act of listening, learning, and then asking yourself as a leader, what part have I played in the culture that exists today, both the good and the bad? What have I walked past? What have I not spoken up about? What have I allowed to happen on my watch? Because when leaders spend time reflecting on those questions, they shift. And when leaders shift, the organisation shifts. Now, that's not to say you don't need, a great policy environment, making sure that the structures are not replicating adverse impacts for particular groups, all those other things as well, the system, structures, processes. But I actually believe it starts with leaders finding their personal why.
And in terms of time, I don't know if there's any data on that. When do we see this getting into institution and becoming part of the way the institution actually operates?
Yeah, so from young people coming in and being inculcated with a certain culture, I think it happens very, very quickly. So when I come in and we'll go back to the military example, but there's a million organisations. I don't necessarily just want to refer to them, but I think really within a year when you come in, you're not looking at the chief of a defence force or even a few layers up. You're looking at the next layer up from you. How is that person behaving? Do they listen? Are they respectful? How do they treat others? And you're learning how to be in the organisation from the messages that you're getting there, and of course the other symbolism and things. So that happens very, very quickly. So I think absolutely you've got to be helping people on the front line understand why this agenda matters to your organisation, like the different agencies of the UN, why it matters, and also what is your part. So each person has to understand their part in creating culture change, because every one of us makes up the culture. But yeah, unless you do something very early on, you can either create a whole cohort of workers who think it's okay to be racist, to be sexist, discrimination, or you can go the other direction.
And it's the consistency of those cohorts understanding that, right?
Yeah.
Like over time.
Yeah. And I think getting out, having human conversations and listening, because even when I go into other private sector organisations, they'll have a strategy that they call leadership in the field. So, leaders at all different levels will get out to the operations of the organisation. But instead of having human conversations with people, so saying, look, it's wonderful to meet you. How are you finding it? Do you enjoy this work? What could be better? What could be different? Instead of doing that, they're going out saying, oh, well, you're not wearing your PPE properly, or, I noticed that you didn't do this when you should have done that. That type of conversation, that just makes, people more anxious and nervous. I really, recommend when I go into organisations that we need to listen. It's the most important thing.
Beautiful message on the power of listening. And to close off our conversation, on a personal note, I'd love to touch base on the importance of self-care, especially in the AIDS sector. When we deal with the prevention and response to sexual misconduct, it can come across as, it can maybe take a toll on you, hearing these stories, potentially even experiencing it. Could you share one self-care practice that you personally prioritize?
Yeah, I love that you're asking about self-care, Guni. It's fantastic because it's something that the human rights defenders have actually taught me. You know, they've taught me that being well, both physically and mentally, that's the ultimate active empowerment in any country across the world today. In many countries, it's the ultimate act of political defiance as well. And when I think about it, our movement for change, even the gender equality movement, whatever movement you're part of, that movement will only ever be as strong as every one of us who makes that up. So, you know, we will commit to staying well, and that includes mentally well. So for me, I adopt that, I try and adopt it as a daily practice. I actually have a self-care plan, which is a bit nerdy, I know, but I do, with check-ins with my husband to see, you know, how he thinks I am as well. But when I used to go on mission, I'd do a number of things. So I have a daily practice, but people will have any, you know, a whole range of things. For me, it was about mindfulness and meditation. So I would meditate early in the morning before I would go out to refugee camps, before I would go out and have, you know, sometimes, you know, quite robust discussions with ministers and others. I'd also cover myself in white light. I've got a toolbox which has my techniques in it: visualization, mindfulness, you know, poetry, all those types of things. And often I travel also with my own kind of, it's like an inner for a sleeping bag. It's a silk inner, you know, not expensive, just from a shop. But I kind of feel it doesn't matter where I'm sleeping. If I'm sleeping, you know, anywhere, in a tent, on a submarine, you know, in a refugee camp or whatever, it doesn't matter what type of bed, I have my silk inner that I can get into, and I know that I'm safe in that moment. Because often in this increasingly hostile world where human rights and, you know, it's just so polarized and we're seeing such regression, you know, you're often potentially at risk of arbitrary detention and those types of things. So I think doing everything we can to remind ourselves that we are safe and that we will be strong, not even in service of ourselves, but in service of a cause. That's really very important. And the other thing I do, Guni, the final thing that I'd like to say I do is everyone I meet, I ask them, how do you stay energetically replenished and sane and active in this, you know, in this time of turbulence and disequilibrium?
So we learn from each other as well.
Yeah.
So thank you, Elizabeth Broderick, for being on the #NoExcuse podcast.
Thanks so much, Guni. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening. If you have any feedback or questions, feel free to reach out to us at prseah@who.int. Until the next time, goodbye.